good to see all of you, and I want to tell you what a pleasure it is to walk with you today and look at how the Union Army refused their left flank. And as we walk, we're going to be doing a lot of walking. Logistically, we're going to make our way over toward Little Round Top. We will just make our way up the southern slope. We won't go all the way to the crest. And then we're going to turn east and go down Wright Avenue, Howe Avenue, and maybe a little bit out in front of Howe and Wright Avenue. There's a field out in front of there. I'll describe how pretty much everything that went on after the fighting on Little Round Top. There's a lot of extra work that was done to secure the hill. And so, like let's say you were to see a movie and something's on the editing room floor and it didn't make it in, you show it later, maybe in a documentary. This is all on the editing room floor of the story. It's normally just chopped off the end, and there's a the end after the 20th Maine makes their charge. And I also want to dedicate the program to Pete Carmichael. I worked with him in 1985 at Appomattox, and then I worked with him again in 1987 at Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania Wilderness, Chancellorsville. So we were teenagers working together way back when, and I went to the viewing last night and got to talk to the family. As a lot of people did. Some of you maybe don't know him. He was the director of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, professor of history for many years there at Gettysburg College. Really grew the program. C-SPAN and other television networks regularly filmed conferences that he did there. I remember rooms full of people in these conferences, maybe 1,000, 1,200 people. He had a charismatic personality and a good friend and great father and husband. So anyway, I'll do my best with him in memory. The funeral's going on; it's getting ready to start. So my heart's really full, you know. Now, I mean, you think about when you lose somebody from your youth. Part of your youth is gone at that point. You lose a little bit of your youth. So, as we talk about this refused flank, first thing I'd like to do is to walk a few paces, not very far, but just far enough that you can see D Field, because I want you to see where the Confederates were and why the line had to be refused. So what we're going to do is peel off in that direction, try to stay along the shoulder, warn each other if you see a car, and we'll just try to get out of the way of the car. So here we go. No, sure. Yeah, that one you can take it. Now, part of the refusing of the flank, that's bending back your flank at right angles to taper it so your enemy doesn't get around the flank. Part of that involved cavalry, and some of you know that Farnsworth, Elon Farnsworth's cavalry was over here on the third day of the battle, reinforcing the flank, and that's part of our broader story. And over in the woods here is a pedestal from where the 5th New York Cavalry Monument originally was placed. And this is maybe more than you want to know, but on battle walks like this, we get into the nuts and bolts and the nitty-gritty and things you wouldn't hear on the daily programs. There's a pedestal back in here where the 5th New York Cavalry Monument was placed wrongly. It was put in the wrong location. And before John Batchelder retired, he was the first historian. He oversaw the GBMA, Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association, before the National Park Service was here. He turned over the keys to the National Park Service in 1895. He passed away in 1896. It was like his life's work was complete. And he was just an architect in those first 30 years after the war. He put up the high watermark monument and helped supervise the placement of a lot of monuments on the battlefield. But he sort of admitted just before he stepped down that the 5th New York Cavalry Monument was in the wrong place. So it was moved. You see the car coming towards us. To the left of the car over in the woods is where the new 5th New York location is. When we say new, we're talking about over 120 years ago it was moved there. Before Batchelder turned over the keys to the Park Service. And the plan was then the other Farnsworth Cavalry monuments, which would include the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry and the 1st Vermont Cavalry. All of them were supposed to align on the 5th. So when the 5th was put in the wrong location, that means the other cavalry monuments were put in the wrong location. That prompted Andy Custer years ago to come out with a controversial article in Blue and Gray magazine about how the cavalry battle was further south than where we think, because Batchelder got to move one monument. He handed over the keys to the Park Service, he passed away, and the other monuments were never moved. So a lot of the histories are written around where the monuments are sitting, and they're sitting in the wrong location. So that's just something to think of and chew on as we walk along. And I'm going to take you down to D Field now.
And they don't talk about that. I mean, maybe I wrote them in a good little. That's something I never knew.
So this is called D Field, and for Gettysburg aficionados, it's really important, related to the 3rd day of the battle, and it's part of our broader discussion of securing the left flank and refusing it, bending it back so it faces the enemy squarely and prevents the flank from being turned. And so cavalry plays a role in that, so we're starting with cavalry since we're in the vicinity. Now, the 1st Vermont Cavalry Monument was placed right there, in alignment with the 5th New York Cavalry Monument. When the 5th was moved down here, the 1st probably should have been moved down there. And Andy, she took me back in there years ago when she was first writing the article, and she showed me where she thinks Farnsworth actually was killed, because that monument traditionally marks where Farnsworth was killed. You've heard of the Farnsworth House in Gettysburg. It's named after. He was one of the Union Brigadier General Cavalry commanders here, one of the sort of the rising stars in the cavalry. Had recently been promoted to Brigadier General and tragically killed here. And the monument says he was killed very near this spot, and that's the 1st Vermont Cavalry. If Batchelder had not passed away, or if the job had been completed, that marker would have, according to Andy, been placed several hundred yards further to your left. She's found what she believes is the exact spot based on Potter rocks. Colonel Potter commanded the 18th Pennsylvania, and there's a letter in the National Archives and written by Potter, and in there he has a map that he drew out, and he shows some rocks, and he draws them unusually well. They're as big as Devil's Den. And he said this is where the 18th Pennsylvania Cavalry was. So she found that spot, and you can still find those rocks up in the woods. They're massive. They're as big as Devil's Den. And then from there you can walk a few paces out to where the 1st Vermont would have been, and sort of guess pretty closely where he would have been killed on the 3rd day of the battle. And she built a little shrine down in the woods. She showed it to me, just a pile of rocks, and then she put a wreath on top of it with flowers. That was the actual spot. Now, this field is known as D Field, and the reason it's known as D Field, it was a guy by the name of Parsons who was with the 1st Vermont Cavalry, and he wrote an article after the war to Battles and Leaders. It was originally called Century Magazine in New York City. They published articles of veterans around between 1884 and 1887. Later it was assembled in volumes 1 through 5, Battles and Leaders. Volume 3 is Gettysburg, and in Volume 3 is where that article eventually landed. Parsons talks about the cavalry charge, Farnsworth's cavalry charge, and he draws out a map of key locations in the charge, and it stops A, B, C, D, E, F, and it's a dotted line showing the route the cavalry took. What the cavalry was doing was there were Texas and Alabama troops along a stone wall that's over here in the woods. It runs in that direction. It's where the Confederates fell back to after they failed to take Little Round Top. So the cavalry was down in here trying to flush the Confederates out, get them to break contact and retreat back to Seminary Ridge, and that would secure the entire Union line. Confederates had already fallen back after they failed on Pickett's charge on the 3rd day, and they fell back beyond point of contact at Culp's Hill. They fell back all the way to Benner's Hill, and then all the way to Oak Ridge by July 4th. So the Confederates were breaking contact everywhere, but they were a little more stubborn here. Contact means within the infamous 300 paces, about 100 yards. Napoleon called it the infamous 300 paces. All combat's within about 300 paces. Small arms combat. And the Union is saying, okay, it's time to let go. You need to let go of this position. And you could hear the cheers of Pickett's, as Pickett's troops were being repulsed about a mile north of us. You could hear those roars and cheers. but just holding on with a claw of death were these Texans and Alabamians. So the cavalry came in to just try to loose their grip and try to sweep them on out of here. So Parsons, in his map, in his route, dotted line route map that he drew, he shows it is A, B, C, D, and when he gets to this point, he calls this D. And so we just call it D field. And some people have looked at it and said, well, the way the loggers cleared out the trees, it's sort of shaped like a D. And, you know, and the trees here would have been used by the Slider family for firewood to cook and to keep their house warm 8 months out of the year, and mend fences and barns and houses. And Slider property is just down at the bottom of the hill. They own this property, and they used Clydesdale horses to, after they would use two-man saws and cut the trees down, and then they would have these huge Clydesdale horses carry the logs down towards their house, which we're not going to go that far down there. But in any case, the Parsons account, one of the things I'll say about the Parsons account is he says that his source on where Farnsworth was killed was secondhand. He said it was a Confederate who told him. He said he didn't actually see it. So we found the Confederate source, and the Confederate talks about how he was badly wounded. The Union cavalry charged somewhere through, probably further south is where he was killed, but they eventually came up through here. And there were Texas troops here, Alabama troops, and they just turned and fired into the cavalry. And the way Parsons told it is that him or Jeannie was badly wounded, and that he took his own life at that point. Well, so that story has gone around for years, and it's imagined that maybe it was right there. Andy did a little further research and found that his body was actually carefully looked at the train station, and there were no injuries indicating that he had taken his life. Also, the Confederate account that Parson uses in his article that's published in New York City around 1884, it says that he was wearing a white shirt when he died. Well, the coroner's report does not indicate he was wearing a white shirt. So we think this was somebody else. And
there was another officer who had a white jacket on, I think.
It could very well have been, but it's looking less and less likely like it was Farnsworth. But, you know, you can never be certain. But this is part of the overall fighting. And then Bill brought up something that I thought was important about memory. You know, when you study history, you have to study memory. I remember in graduate school once I had to take a 4-month course on memory, how the brain works and how we retain memories, and how emotions factor into what we remember, and continuity and break with continuity, and how our brain arranges memories and how we reorder them, and or what triggers them, and so memory is very important. Selective memory, what we choose to remember as a country, what we choose to forget, what we choose to emphasize, and that's an important strand when you're studying history, is memory, and what we choose to write down, what we choose to emphasize, and what we choose to forget. Well, I was not long ago, I just throw in this personal story, make it real quick. They teach us in the Ranger schools, don't just give out information, try to connect with the visitor emotionally. Don't overdo it, but try here and there to just give out more than facts. So I'll give a personal story. When I was 8 years of age, I went with my grandfather to an amusement park. They took me there every summer. My parents would take me, the grandparents, and they'd take me to this amusement park. And anyway, we quit going there. My grandfather passed away. And so anyway, I read online where it had gone bankrupt in 1986, and they had turned it into a parking lot and a grocery store. So I was in that area, and my wife said, "Hey, you want to drive over there and take a look at it?" I said, "Yeah, I'd like to." She said, "Are you sure?" She said, "It's going to really mess with your memories because it's just a grocery store there now in a parking lot." I said, "Let's do it." She said, "We'll get dinner afterwards." So we went over there. I said, "I'd like to stand where my grandfather and I got out of the car when I was 8 years old, and I held his hand, and I remember the warmth of his hand, and I remember seeing cotton candy and Ferris wheels, and I remember seeing Richard Petty's car sitting on there on display, and I have these distinct memories, and it was so big in my memory. So we got there, and it was just paved. Everything was paved. And so I looked around, and this is an 8-year-old kid 50 years later trying to remember all of this. And I looked and I said, okay, that must have been where the skylift was. Look, and there's a house up there on the hill now. And the cable cars must have come down to here. And so I must have been standing there. But I was only about this tall then. So everything was much bigger in my memory. My wife and I ran into somebody in the parking lot. He was about my age. And my wife said, can you tell us, did you know anything about it? He said, oh yeah, my grandparents used to drop me off here all the time. I spent hours here. He said it was tragic. I watched them tear down the roller coaster. And he said, let me tell you where it was. So he started recreating the scene for us. And he said, if you go over behind the grocery store, he said, there's still some remnants of the old choo-choo train. And I remembered as a kid, I had memories of riding that and walking around. And it was near the haunted house that I remember. Yeah. So he said, you have to go over there. It's behind the dumpsters, off to the left, behind the grocery store. We went over there, and I said, I remember standing here, and I looked up, I get goosebumps now, and there was the remnant of the track. Whoever built the shopping center never tore it completely apart. Wow. And in the end, I think I found the spot where I held my grandfather's hand. The guy that was in the parking lot said it would have had to have been right over there because that was an overflow parking area, and the angle you're describing was probably over there. So I stood there. And my wife said, are you ready to go? I said, yeah, I'm ready to go now. But Bill's point was these veterans were coming back 20, 25 years later. And they had been through so many battles and there's so many memories. Try to imagine going back to a neighborhood you grew up in and you thought you knew all the streets, but there's some that you forget. And then the difficulty of placing monuments. Okay, that's added bonus there, talking about memory and how it relates to things. So now what we're going to, thank you. And now we're on the south slope of Big Round Top. This is the area where the Southerners fell back to. Now we're going to go up to where the 20th Maine built their field fortification. And I have some surprising things to tell you about it. Okay, Confucius said thousands of years ago, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. And I think that's why people like the Ranger Walks, is that we're not being fired upon, but there's a kinetic movement going on, and that's an avenue in which you learn. And so, plus the better blood oxygen flow to your organs, the healthier you are. And the blood oxygen increases when you're walking. That's why you're able to think through problems when you walk. So we're walking the actual ground. It's more than just seeing it. You're actually walking it now, and it'll stick with you. We got a car coming up on our right, and I just wanted to make a brief stop here and point out some of these boulders on your left. Now this area is known as Devil's Kitchen. You always hear a lot about Devil's Den, but there's a Devil's Kitchen and there's a Devil's Playground. And there are areas that are just chocked full of rocks. I was talking to Caitlin Ball. She's the archaeologist in the park. And she showed me some pictures of archaeology she's been doing up there in the last 2 years. She found a ramrod, part of a bayonet. She found percussion caps, bullets, all up there in that area. By the way, it was rockier during the battle. Under this pavement is one of the original pulverized stone roads. And that's true down in Devil's Den off to your front there and all around the wheat field. The original roads, pulverized stone roads, are just recycled stone from Devil's Kitchen. That's essentially the original roads. So there was a lot more stone that's just been ground up and it's turned into hard surfaces for horse and carriages and Model Ts in the early days. But this is called Devil's Kitchen, and the Confederates ensconced in there, and they used it as a place to fall back on and also to charge forward against Little Round Top from. And as soon as this car goes past us on our right, we'll continue to ascend the south slope of Big Round Top. Yeah, do you see anything unusual about the wording in this sign? Yes. So somebody read it aloud if you would.
This wall was built for defense July 3rd afternoon, 1863.
There you go. So when did Joshua Chamberlain defend this ridge? Second. So this was built after he defended the ridge. A lot of people don't know that this wall was put up as part of refusing, our theme today, refusing the Union left after the fighting on Little Round Top. So these walls were built then. Now Chamberlain is very careful in his accounts to talk about how there wasn't a stone wall. He said that there was an irregular shelf of rocks, and then they found their way sort of to ensconce themselves in those rocks. And then this was built after the repulse. Now I should say also, in contrast to that, this is one of the few stone walls on the battlefield that wasn't in its current location. That is, wasn't already here. If I had to give a percentage, I would say 9 out of every 10 stone walls that you see on the battlefield were built by farmers long before the battle. The area is really rocky, and every time they turned up a rock, they didn't have the equipment and the machinery to carry it very far, so they would just sprinkle the rocks along their property line, clip their hawk's nose or put a ring in a hawk's nose so the hawk couldn't root under the fence. The fence would be, stone fence would be about this high. Hawks certainly couldn't scale the fence. So the Pennsylvania Germans who settled here in the 1740s called them hog-tight fences. And what the soldiers did when they arrived here was they would dig in on the side that they were hiding behind and take the dirt and pack it into the wall. This is the era before barbed wire, so you would go around, find branches from trees, cut the branches off, sharpen them like a pencil. It's called abattis or palisades. And the side facing the enemy, you would stick those pencils out and make the side facing the enemy look like the back of a porcupine. So this all happened after the actual fighting occurred on July 2nd. This is part of the refused flank. Now I'm going to show you where Chamberlain's troops actually were. It might mess with your paradigm. I'm going to show you actually where the 20th Maine was when they defended here on July 2nd. So we're going to go back down the hill, and if you would, let's stay on this side of the road. We don't have to walk very far to see what we want to see. Kathy Harrison, who was the senior historian here in the 1980s and 1990s, she told me that this stone wall was probably recycled. In other words, it was already existing somewhere on the hill, and they just transferred it that night, did the 20th Maine. And Chamberlain said in his post-war accounts that his troops fought behind an irregular shelf of rocks, not the stone wall. We've got a car coming. This is the irregular shelf. What he means by that is it's not even, and some of the rocks are more advanced than the others towards the enemy. They sort of jut out. And maybe someone here would want to say, why was it actually a better defense for the 20th Maine, these troops from Brunswick and Portland, and and Brewer, why was it a better defense to be behind this irregular shelf of rocks than it would be behind the stone wall at the top of the hill? How did it serve the 20th Maine even better to be forward of the hill and ensconced inside these larger rocks here?
You're on the military crest?
Yes, there you go. All right, very good. There's when you're setting up a defense, you don't usually want to set up your defense at the highest point. That's called the geographic crest. Because if you make one mistake, your enemy's going to fill the vacuum between you and where you set up your defense. And anything you don't defend, it's going to be presumed by your enemy you're giving to them for free. They will fill that vacuum. So if you're going to start your defense at the highest point, your enemy's going to meet you there. Because you don't put up resistance until there. You're giving yourself no margin for error. One mistake and you're on the reverse side of the crest. Now you're having to attack back uphill just to reclaim what you had. So you want to form on the military crest, which is out in front of the geographic crest. It's a little bit lower. It gives yourself room for error, for cushion, for falling back, mistakes, flanking, and you still protect the crest. Another reason why you advance from the geographic crest, the highest point, to the military crest, which is lower and out in front of, is if you have if you're out in front of the geographic crest and you're on a forward slope down a little bit lower on a military crest, it lessens the disparity in what's called parabolic trajectory. If you've ever fired a small arms rifle, let's say you hold the barrel level with the ground. and you want to fire 300 yards, and you pull the trigger, will the ball go 300 yards? No, what will happen to it? It'll droop right into the ground. That's parabolic trajectory, it's a curve. And it maybe will go into the ground 150 yards from here, but not 300 yards. So if you want to reach the full 300 yards, what do you have to do with the rifle? You have to aim high so that rainbow arc carries all the way. Well, that's problematic on a battlefield. If you're defending a hill like this and you're up closer to the geographic crest, your enemy knows that they can get under those guns and the curvature of the flight will go over their heads. It's not 100%, but it's a whole lot safer when you get under the guns. Think of Normandy Beach and how terrible it was for the Allies to cross that beach. The barbed wire, and the Nazis had crossfire. But once the Americans and the Allies got really close to the cliffs of Normandy Heights, they were under the German guns who could no longer fire straight down, and then there were blindside accesses with ropes to get to the top. You can get under the gun. That's why Burnside kept charging at Fredericksburg, and the canals slowed and created choke points so they couldn't get out into the field quick enough. It was snow-covered fields, so it was slippery. But Burnside knew if one of those waves got within maybe 250 yards of the stone wall at the base of Marie's Heights, none of the Confederate artillery pieces on Marie's Heights would be able to fire down at them because the guns would naturally go over them. So he kept trying, and the Irish got out front, said fall to blue, get everybody out of the way. We're going to get within that distance. So when you're on real high ground, parabolic trajectory is really accentuated, and an attacker can get under it. So it was smart of Chamberlain to move forward because it put him closer to the ground level, and sort of leveled out the firing at close range. Can you see that? Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's just smarter to be there. Okay, so anyway, this is where Chamberlain actually defended and repulsed the 15th Alabama. It was these rocks, not the stone wall up there. The stone wall is just reinforcement after the fighting to refuse the flank. And in thinking on your feet, what would be another advantage to have men in light blue trousers, dark blue coats from the state of Maine with red Maltese crosses on their hats, 1st Division, 5th Corps, as you're imagining them there? Why? You can see the stone wall up there that they built after the fight, but then before that was there, you can see the irregular shelf of rocks continued. What's another advantage to have the 20th Maine clustered 3-4 men at a time behind these large boulders? What's another advantage? And an irregular shelf, that is, it's uneven, it's not a straight line. Interlocking fields of fire, what do I mean by that? What's the interlocking field of fire?
This way here can intersect with this in here.
Intersections, right. So somebody walks into a crossfire. Your goal in combat is always maximum firepower. That's best achieved through crossfire. That's why there's so many battles at bloody angles and dead angles and mule shoes and horseshoes and battles of bulges and starboard sides of fort. If you can surround somebody and the trajectory is right on an angle, it's hard to miss, because you miss somebody on one side, you hit somebody in the back on the other side. And the defender's fire is dispersed because they're firing out from that same angle, if you will. So interlocking fields of fire create crossfire, and the Confederates would walk right into a crossfire where 2 men were shooting on them from 2 different sides. Really increases the chance. And then the Confederates having to turn and fire in different directions, which means his fire is eccentric. It's going out like sun's rays in all directions, while the defender, in this case the 20th Maine, is crossfiring the same place. It doubles the chance of hitting something. All right, just basic math. Now also, people ask me daily, what did it look like through here at the time? Well, before the roads, there would just have been a continuum of trees across where the roads are, but they wouldn't have been as thick. Cattle constantly grazed through here, so the lower vegetation was gone. The trees were constantly being logged for firewood, we said that earlier, for mending fences and barns and houses. The trees, too, were not original to when the Pilgrims settled America. These would have been secondary growth trees. They've been cut down and used for practical purposes so many times. They were young trees, maybe half this height. So if you're trying to picture the whole thing, you know, paint the picture, that's what would have looked like. And when the Confederates first came out here, this is it, we'll just add this related to the 20th Maine's fighting. When the 15th Alabama first came out of these woods here, and they would have been visible a good 20, 30 yards up into the woods because of the underbrush just not being there. The Confederates rushed 80 troops right at the 20th Maine. And what that was a distraction. Sort of like, I try to get your attention. And while those 80 Confederates just rushed right into those enclave of rocks, if you would watch me here, stand where you are, that distracted for about 100 Confederates to circle around like those people are doing, but they went around to try to get behind, and then now you've got a crossfire.
Yeah.
And the Union had to refuse their line there to prevent being taken in reverse. So that's what happened with 15th Alabama. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at a stone wall over here that was also built after the second day's fight and into the morning hours of the third and final day. Yeah, I did a tour on Little Round Top yesterday. Were any of you with me?
Yep.
And were you with me on the snake came out on the tour? And we were standing right beside a stone wall, and the snake came out like that, and the kids were interested, and they kept walking over. I said, no, let's keep our distance there. And he was just sort of, he listened to the whole thing. And he didn't move until the very end, did he? So he listened, and he said, yep, my great-grandpa was here, and that's how it happened. Now, the stone wall that you see here was built after the fighting on Little Round Top on July 2nd. Into the night of the 2nd and the morning of the 3rd, even as the 20th Maine was building that stone wall up there. Going back to an earlier theme in the summer, Bill, where I was talking about fog of war and friction of war. Fog is uncertainty. The participants don't have knowledge of the outcome like we do. It's unfair for us to impose on them our certainty, and they certainly lack that, you know, and they had incomplete knowledge. Or friction of war are unexpected things that slow down an attack. And I'll add a little bit of that here. You and I know the Confederates wouldn't attack here again on July 3rd, that they would shift their emphasis more directly at Cemetery Hill. And we call it Pickett's Charge. But on July 3rd, you had no guarantee of that. So this is the closest thing you can get to certainty. I'll throw up these stone walls here. And I'll say a couple of things about the Confederates. There was a soldier in the 5th Texas who wrote a diary, published his diary. And he talked about being here on July 3rd. He said that the 5th Texas was ordered to advance again on July 3rd. And he said he was horrified with fright. And he describes fight or flight. He says he wants to go forward and live up to the responsibility, but he's so relieved when he finally hears it's called off. And he said the reason why they were ordered to advance was to try to cover their wounded that were out in front of them. And that was on July 3rd. He said also they were trying to break contact with the Union troops and begin the retreat back to Warfield Ridge, about a mile from here. So sometimes you have to attack to evacuate. You all know that. Sometimes you have to attack to allow things to go on behind the scenes so that they have a distraction to get clear. He said that this soldier in the 5th Texas, he said that while his mind was racing, can I go forward? I'm not. We're not going to go forward. Shall I go forward? Shall I not? And he was just fighting himself with this internal fight or flight. He said that artillery shells started landing right out in front of him. That would be right along here, along this road here, Warren Avenue. And they were from Confederate guns, presumably Riley and Bachman and Eshelman and some of the Confederate guns up on Warfield Ridge about a mile from here. What those shells were doing was they were trying to fire into the Union line and create a screen, a break, so the infantry could fall back. So I guess when it was decided, if you piece it all together, when it was decided the infantry shouldn't attack to make room for everybody to escape, it was decided let's do the same with artillery. And by the way, the artillery shell that was found unexploded last May of 2023, where the Fort Belvoir had to come in with an armored truck and take it away and bury it and detonate it. We got 80% of the fragments back. That was doing all the archaeology on the hill for the restoration of the hill. It was closed for 2 years. Well, that shell was found just a little bit off to your left, right about where the 5th Texas was. It was a Confederate shell, most likely. And the first thing I thought was that 5th Texas account when I heard that it was likely a Confederate shell and where it was. Why would there be Confederate shells in this area? They fired them on July 3rd from Warfield Ridge to try to sort of press the Union so the infantry could break contact and get outside of firing range. That's how you break contact sometimes. So interesting. Another important point to make here is Confederate point is General Lee came to see General Longstreet on the morning of July 2nd, July 3rd, to consider renewing the assault against Cemetery Hill. Remember, Longstreet said it was the saddest day of my life. He said that no 15,000 men ever raved a battle could take Cemetery Hill. He tried to talk Lee out of it. He said, I've had my scouts out all night, and we've been looking for a way around the flank. He said, it'll take some time, but it'll be easy enough to do. I may mention that in the conclusion again and show you the place where Longstreet had researched where he was going to make his attack from the reverse slope and why this line is refused. Anyway, in that conversation, Longstreet said to Lee, you just sort of as a footnote, you don't want to attack this hill again. He said they've been building stone walls up there all night. And they could hear it, the Confederates could hear clump, clump, clump. I live next to an orchard, and the immigrants that live there that have worked it for years, it's a large industrial orchard, sometimes they have bonfires out at night, and on weekends you can hear music playing, and you look out in the field, it's a beautiful sight, but you can hear them singing and clapping. But during the day, sometimes I'll hear all day long, clunk, clunk. And they're going around with a pickup truck picking up rocks so that they can extend the orchard a little bit further, and just rocks everywhere. And I can't help but think of the sound of the rocks being put in the back of the pickup truck. All night long, Longstreet heard this, and it was difficult enough as it was attacking it on July 2nd. Now you definitely don't want to attack it. And Lee didn't want to attack it anyway, but for being really crystal clear, Longstreet said they've been building walls here all night. Okay, now what I want you to see, there's no substitute for walking the ground. The Warren Avenue breaks through the stone wall that was built here the night of the 2nd, and wee hours of the morning of the 3rd. And Sykes Avenue does the same over on this end. But if you get past the breaks where the roads are, notice it's a continual stone wall from here all the way to the top of Big Round Top. And we're going to walk, there's a little trail, I'm going to take you up through there, and it comes back out onto the main road, and we'll be on hard pavement in a few minutes. But I want to take you back up in there and show you the wall. And before we leave, I want you to think about, we're always doing history at a higher level when we do comparative analysis. When you look for patterns across time and space, it tells you something deeper about human behavior. You all know about the traverse on Culp's Hill that Pap Green built. At right angles, he had field fortifications built to protect the flank. He refused the flank with field fortification. And when you take the guide exam in a few months, if some of you are taking that, I haven't seen this year's version, but I'll be real surprised if it doesn't ask, where was the traverse? All Gettysburg aficionados need to know where the traverse was on Culp's Hill. Is this not the traverse, is my question. Is this not the traverse of the Union left flank?
I think it is.
If the traverse on Culp's Hill that Pap Green built is the right flank traverse, is this not the traverse of the left flank? And it just hasn't been called that. Okay. And think about where it's located and try to compare in your mind today, to go over to Culp's Hill, exactly where it's built in relation to the traverse over on Culp's Hill. Very similar.
But wasn't there the traverse? Didn't Chamberlain have like a small traverse when he refuses the line on?
Yeah.
You got another traverse there, right?
That's right. Between upper and lower Culp's Hill, there's a saddle.
Right.
Well, between Big Round Top and Little Round Top, you were just in the saddle. So building a traverse in a saddle is a pattern.
Did they get artillery over here?
On Little Round Top they did.
But, I mean, along this line here, through here.
Not that I can recall.
It wouldn't have been effective anyway, right?
No.
No, you don't put the artillery down front here.
But that's a really good question though, because that brings up what William Oates talked about. So don't let me forget that. So just kind of look along the breadth of the stone wall there. This is a really good view. This was all built after the fighting on Little Round Top. In the uncertainty, the fog of war, as Clausewitz called it, you build yourself some assurances. Now, the troops that built this stone wall, make sure I talk about William Oates, okay? The troops that built this wall were the 5th and 12th Pennsylvania Reserves, along with the 20th Maine. The way this played out was at the end of Chamberlain's defense of Little Round Top. After the left wing under Ellis Spear wheeled and took the Confederates in reverse, and the Confederates suffered 180 casualties, all told, killed, wounded, and captured. And that final pivot by the left wing folded around the Confederates and caused maybe upwards of 100 to surrender in that area. All right after that happened, the 20th Maine, you know what they did immediately? They fell asleep. They immediately just laid down and fell asleep. I ran across that one day just reading through the vertical files in the Park Library and went, whoa. And it makes sense. The 5th Corps marched 56 miles in 3 days from Frederick, Maryland to get here. The Confederates marched 26 miles in the same day. And the canteens that were sent back to the creek near D Field to be filled up, they never came back. They got captured. So these soldiers went hours without drinking water. It was probably in the mid to high 80s, feels like right around 90 degrees, wool uniforms, fighting for 2.5 hours.
They burned up all their adrenaline, so.
Their adrenaline, once it's gone, you just hit a wall. And then the smoke would have been trapped by the canopy of trees, which were in full bloom, the thick sulfurous smoke. And as Bill points out, when you burn off your adrenaline, you all probably know this. When you hit a wall, physically, when you hit a wall, you can't come back. You can't will yourself back. Your legs are like wood. I mean, you can continually say, I'm going to dig down deep and I'm going to do this, but you can't will. The only way you recover is 72 hours sleep. Once you've spent everything emotionally and physically, you can't bring it back. That's both sides fought each other to a frazzle, we might say. So the 20th Maine, the first thing they did was they just laid down. They thought, okay, we got a little break, and they slept. And then suddenly they were startled and awoken. Also, I was reading through before I came back out on the program. I read back through the accounts, and I ran across another interesting one, that there were 500 Confederate prisoners taken through here, not just by the 20th Maine, but by the 83rd Pennsylvania, 44th New York, 16th Michigan. 500 captives. And guess what they did with them? Immediately had them start burying the dead. And so they were burying, the account said there were at least 50 dead out in front of each one of those regiments. And so the Confederates who were taken prisoner were put on that detail to bury them, while the Union men were sleeping. That just gives you a picture of how tight things were and tough they were. So the stone walls are being put together, and you would also fell trees. You knew how to chop a tree to get it to fall towards your enemy, and you sharpened the branches. So if the Confederates ever do try to attack here, the fall trees create corridors where you have interlocking fields of fire. You basically draw them into a corridor where you have crossfire on them. So it doesn't mean the Confederates won't attack again, but you're trying to decrease the percentage odds of them being successful so they'll think twice about it. And this was going on then all night. Also, the Confederates talked about the stone walls in their letters home. The letters wouldn't have gotten home for a couple of weeks, but you write them, eventually they take your mail, put it in a bag, they find a train station, put it on a train. There's several interchanges. Eventually, 2-3 weeks later, the letter gets home. And we have copies of some of those in our Park Archives, and there's two things that the Confederates talk about more than anything else in their letters home, Confederate survivors. The red barns, because in Virginia, there are not a lot of red barns, but Pennsylvania, a lot of red barns. And they used sort of an iodine in the mixture of the paint, and that would cause it to turn kind of a rust red. Other people would say the Native Americans who lived here, the Susquehannocks, you probably know they lived down in Devil's Den, and we found hundreds and hundreds of flat stones down there when we cleared the trees 15, 20 years ago, all that acres of woods around Devil's Den. And those were used as weights to hold down the bottom of a long hut, animal skin long hut, or teepees, so drafts don't get underneath. It just loads of them out there. Also, arrowheads have been found all through here. The Susquehannocks lived here, but they would paint their long huts, the animal skins, in deer blood, and that may have influenced some of the first Pennsylvania bank barns being painted red. So the stone walls here then. Oh yes, and the other thing that the Confederates would talk about is in their letters home was the stone walls and how the Union Army was behind the stone wall. And they're not just talking about something aesthetic. For hey, this is beautiful and this would belong on HGTV or something. For the sake of contrast here. They're talking about they were behind stone walls. That's a real advantage. So for Union soldiers, they build this thing just high enough that they can get down behind it. And it's not 100%, but your enemy doesn't have that cover at all. So let me also add something else about the stone wall, about the hill itself. Some of you know Clausewitz said in his book on war, be wary of defending a wooded hill. You can be surrounded and not even know it. Your key positions on battlefields tend to be clear of trees. Think of Cemetery Hill. You could see Pickett's charge a mile away. That's the whole point of Cemetery Hill. Not only is it a steep position and great artillery position and it controls the road network, but just from a tactical perspective, you don't want your enemy sneaking up on you, so you want a place that's deforested so you can see your enemy a mile away and bring artillery fire on him from that distance. That's why French Indian war forts built in the 1750s, like Fort Necessity, are built in a clearing with sharpened looking sticks in a circle. It's called a palisade. There's a fort inside. And you wonder, why is it out in the open and the woods have been cleared all around for several hundred yards?
You cut down all the trees so that they have to come out in the open to shoot at you.
Exactly. With a bow and arrow or French Charlottesville, the attacker has to show themselves. There's no cover. You make sure you clear the trees back so they're out of range if they want cover. So Cemetery Hill is the ideal from that perspective. Little Round Top and Culp's Hill are not the ideal from that perspective. There are a lot of blind side accesses, and woods also absorb your firepower. You might outnumber your opponent 4-1, but if you outnumber 4-1, it's still going to even out 1-1 because the woods are going to absorb the ratio difference. That's why it's so difficult when your enemy ensconces in a city. You can fire all kinds of projectiles into a city, but it's going to hit buildings and the person's still safe in a cellar or an attic or something like that. A whole lot harder to go door to door and remove because buildings are obstructions. Trees are an obstruction like this. So that would have factored in originally in the Union thinking about whether to defend Little Round Top. If you defend Little Round Top, it means you need field fortifications. Like on Culp's Hill, you need them because you can't see your enemy until the last minute. And you don't have fields. The gentleman asked a really good question about artillery. You don't have artillery fields of fire here. Okay, remind me to talk about William Oates at our next stop.
Oh, okay.
But what I want to do now is get moving. And this trail that's behind us here, take one last look, by the way, before you leave. If you just kind of look, we're not going to walk to the top of Big Round Top, but this stone wall goes all the way to the top of Big Round Top. Longstreet said, here's a really good view right here. You've got a sort of an ascension view there. And then I'll meet you right over here. See, that's the actual artifact. There it is.
You know, one of the most exciting things you said so far?
What's that?
Selective memory.
Yes, sir.
At this age, I can remember things 80 years ago, and I can't tell you what you said yesterday.
Or where I parked my
It's
car.
selective memory.
Right. That's
How do you overcome that? Don't get old.
Right there.
Stay young.
Where's your car key?
I don't know.
It's on my phone.
There it is. You know there it is. Certainly you hear things.
What number car did Richard Petty drive?
43.
43.
Yes,
Did he
43.
Dodge?
I think it was a
I
Dodge
think
at
it
that
was a
time.
Dodge.
I think it was.
Yeah, he was the king.
Yes. I can still remember that.
Oh, brother.
And just let us know, call out if you see a car. And as Bill was saying on the way over, to walk that ground gives you an appreciation of what
Yeah,
the 20th
it
Maine
does.
had to do to ascend that hill and build that wall up there all the way to the top that night. Refusing the line. So, now when we talk about refusing the line, we also, let me give a broader principle, then I'm going to say something about the Pennsylvania Reserves. When a police officer goes into a fight, let's say he's going this way with his handgun. Can everybody picture that?
Mm-hmm.
You also have another police officer follow him and cover his back. That's a refused line. So that's what this is. It's the main Union line is facing that way, facing west, and this is the police officer facing this way, so there's no way around it. That's really what the wheat field was, the fighting in the wheat field in Devil's Den. It was the police officer facing this way to protect the peach orchard line facing that way. Okay.
Good thought.
Now the Pennsylvania Reserves, let's say something about them. They also marched 56 miles in 3 days from Frederick, Maryland. And some of you know they were behind most of the march. They trailed Samuel Crawford's division most of the way. Out in front would have been the other elements of the Pennsylvania Reserve. And there wasn't any halting to allow Joseph Fisher, for instance, or William McCandless to catch up. Because time was of essence, and the troops that arrive first, even if there's a gap between the troops that are in the same unit, eventually they're going to come up and join the fight. But you get there as quick as you can with your advanced troops to see where they're needed. We spend a lot of time talking about the 1st Division and Strong Vincent being part of James Barnes' division, Tilton, Schweitzer, and Strong Vincent. Tilton and Schweitzer go out into the wheat field, and then Vincent comes over here. They were wearing red Maltese crosses. The red symbol is 1st Division. The white symbol is 2nd Division. Powder blue is 3rd Division. So the Pennsylvania Reserves that arrived here that had been lagging since Frederick, and Barnes didn't stop to let them catch up, finally got here, and they were wearing a powder blue Maltese cross on their dark blue hat. Dark blue coats, light blue trousers. I've told many of you, my wife's an art teacher, she says take time to paint the picture. There's always a visual learner, so that the listener sees what you see. Now, as they were rushing to the field, let's go back to when Chamberlain was told by Strong Vincent, hold this ground at all hazards. Right over here to your left is where he was told that, hold this ground at all hazards. What that means, or is implied, is you've got to hold until you can't give up this position. But what it implies is that I'm working behind the scenes to bring up support. So you've got to hold to the end and just trust me that support will come up. And that's what the Pennsylvania Reserve were. They were completing that 56-mile march, and they came up behind the hill here on its east side. And we can see them running towards us with light blue trousers, dark blue coats, dark blue hats, light blue Maltese crosses. They don't have the red Maltese cross like Vincent. They have the light blue, because they're the Pennsylvania Reserves. They're the 3rd Division. And as they're rushing here towards the field, it's dusk. In those days, they didn't have daylight saving time. It was dark at 7 o'clock. So this is probably around 6:45, 7 o'clock. The 20th Maine was sleeping, and they would have been awoken, and then they went on up to the top of the hill. Now, let's also say something about the Pennsylvania Reserves, who ordered them here. Colonel James Rice of the 44th New York, the unit was from Albany, New York. They have a castle on the top of Little Round Top. Rice implies in his after-action report that after Strong Vincent's mortal wounding, that he was giving orders, and he said he ordered Joseph Fisher's reserves to advance into place and to go forward to where they would build that stone wall. I found that interesting when you study the second day of the battle. There's several people that take credit for the victory here. Samuel Crawford does with the charge of the Pennsylvania Reserves on the western slopes, and then Rice claims credit for positioning the reserves here on the refused section of the south slope.
But nobody claims credit when they lose.
Gouverneur Warren claims credit, for seeing the importance of the hill and calling up Vincent. Many people give Vincent credit, Strong Vincent, because he was here 10 minutes before the Confederates attacked. Patty O'Rourke, some people say the 140th New York from Rochester, and Patty O'Rourke is the hero that the 16th Michigan was starting to break, and they came in at just the right moment. So I just noticed that without fighting amongst each other, each one of them in their reports will say something that would indicate they had a hand in it. And
That's good.
And that's good.
That's good.
Now, the Pennsylvania Reserves then were that came through here. There was actually several units. There was the 5th, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th. But the 5th and 12th went to the top of the hill with the 20th Maine. Now, another important point to make here, these are points you can make on a battle walk. It's sort of nuanced details. Some of you know that this is a trick question. It has been in the past on the guide exam. What was the furthest regiment on the left of Vincent's line on July 2nd when they set up line of battle to defend Little Round Top? When they first got into position, what was the furthest regiment on the left? And most people get it wrong and say 20th Maine. They're the end of the line for the whole 3.5 mile Union fish hill. But the answer is the 16th Michigan. The 16th Michigan would have been here, 20th Maine there. 16th Michigan extended the line down towards Honeytown Road, which we're going to be at here real soon. And guess who they were connected with? The 9th New York Cavalry. The same people that were on Barlow's Knoll before Barlow moved out, the same cavalry that was in the peach orchard before Sickles moved out. It's the same 9th New York Cavalry. It was just one company, so maybe 30 mounted cavalry. And William Oates, who was in this fight with the 15th Alabama, he swore up and down in his memoirs that, here comes a car, he swore that when his troops were surrounded with that swing like a door movement of the 20th Maine, he said there were sharpshooters and he said there was cavalry. And we've all just sort of written that off of, well, he was delirious and look, he marched 26 miles. But the 9th New York Cavalry was there, and these woods were not here, and you would have had a view of that cavalry down there. Just something to think about. Just throw in these wrinkles. And then here's one last little minor point to make. When the 20th Maine went out with their skirmishers on July 2nd with the 16th Michigan, soon after, the 4th Maine in Devil's Den, that's where Sickles' line ended. That was Hobart Ward's brigade, the far left of Sickles' line. They complained that they weren't connecting with the 44th New York on top of Little Round Top after they had just arrived, and that there was a gap in that area. And I'm sure somebody was thinking, it doesn't matter if there's a gap because there's a natural breach there. We call it the slaughter pen. I mean, you wouldn't think Confederate troops would even try to cross that area, so why defend it? Well, the 4th Maine was not happy that there was this gap between them at Devil's Den and the 44th New York, the Vincent's brigade on Round Top, and it was maybe 300 or 400 yard gap. So there's enough complaining going on that Vincent, it would have been one of his last orders, he moved the 16th Michigan over to the right where their monument is on Vincent Spur to try to extend down towards the 4th Maine. Also, the 40th New York was essentially cannibalized from another brigade and just moved over to try to plug that gap because the 4th Maine was not comfortable not being connected to the recently arriving Maltese Cross 5th Corps guys here on Round Top. But the skirmishers that went out for the 16th Michigan never got recalled. So when they fell back, they were probably mixed matched with Walter Morrill's Company B, which was out on the skirmish line.
Right.
And they got all mixed together. And so Oates would have saw a larger force than we account for because the 16th Michigan was moved, but their skirmishers were not recalled. These are just finer details. I had a professor that used to say, Troy, take what you need, discard what you don't need. and one last thing I'll say, because I know it's a program like this, we'd be lost if we said this on a daily program, but on a battle walk we can say these kind of details. Also, another point to make is, you all know the left flank marker of the 20th Maine Monument disappeared. And it disappeared, and there's theories that there was a mudslide and it disappeared on the side of the hill. And then there was a theory that when that first hand pump cart trolley ride where you had to pay a nickel to ride from Rosenstill's museum, it was an amusement park ride. It was actually an amusement park back here in the 1870s. And
Really?
pavilions and things like that, and games that you could play. But there was a hand pump cart that pulled an omnibus. Omni means many, and it looked like a stagecoach. And it was hand pumped. Two guys on a teeter would do like this, and it would move. Well, one theory is that when that little track extension was put in, that's when the marker, left flank marker, disappeared. I remember when the state of Maine in the 1990s was trying to find it, they couldn't find it. Maybe one day ground penetrating radar will find it if it exists. But as they were trying to find it, they just finally sort of gave up on it, and they created a new left flank marker that was placed up there. And that's the one that's there today. It's been there since the 1990s. And so what it does is it shows that the Union line refused where the colors were back to where the flank marker is on that a little bit further up the hill. Here's another possible theory, and I'm not the only one that thinks this, but I think it's quite possible. If you look around the battlefield, Union monuments, the veterans, when they put their monuments here 20, 25, 30 years later, never like to depict themselves with a refused line. Now look at the 69th Pennsylvania at the stone wall of the angle. They got a chain there to say our line never refused. It's straight. And other than, somebody pointed out to me once, the 90th Pennsylvania at Oak Hill near the Peace Light is refused. But other than that, there's no other monument on the battlefield. I don't mind being wrong on this, just let me know, because I learned that way. But the only other monument representation for a unit here on the battlefield that wanted in monumentation, permanently set in stone, they wanted to show that their line was refused, is the 20th Maine. So I think it's possible that left flank marker never existed. This is a theory now, it's a theory. That they wouldn't want to display their line as ever being compromised and bent back. And that Company B, if you go down this trail and take a right and walk about 100 yards, you'll find a stone wall that says Company B. Company's about 30 or 40 men.
Yeah.
That actually may have been the left flank marker, that the 20th Maine wanted to present their line as facing the enemy, not refused in front of the enemy. Just a theory, something to think about and talk about. All right, now we're gonna, as soon as we make sure the car's not coming, we're gonna go down the hill, and our next stop will be in front of that beautiful stone lion, which is the Vermont Brigade Monument. There's some shade right here, there's some shade here, there's some shade across the road, some back here. I'm not old enough to surface. So this is the Vermont Brigade Monument. We always think of the Vermont Brigade as the troops that enveloped Pickett's charge in the final stages and turned their right flank. But this was the old first. That's what they referred to themselves. They were the original brigade, and their genealogy goes back to their founding to the American Revolution. They were best known at this stage of the Civil War for fighting at 2nd Fredericksburg during the Battle of Chancellorsville, May 2nd, 3rd of 1863. Lewis Grant's Vermonters did what Burnside's troops couldn't do the previous December 13th. On May 2nd, 3rd, the Vermonters were able to take Marie's Heights. Now, it was a diversionary attack to try to divide Confederate strength between Chancellorsville, which was a little bit further west of there. But it worked, and they went through the streets in the battle just prior to Gettysburg, victorious through the streets of Fredericksburg. So that would mean in this battle, their role wouldn't be as prominent because they had seen a lot of action. That usually factors into things. They were also guarding Manchester, Maryland. Some of you know that they were the furthest corps. Corps around 10,000 troops. There were 7 Union infantry corps. They were the furthest corps from the battlefield when the battle started. They were covering more direct routes to Washington. Washington's 95 miles southeast of here, and Baltimore 60 miles southeast of here. When they were rushed to the battlefield, they marched, did these troops 32 miles in one day to get here. So that's even 5 miles further than the Alabamians and Texans did before they fought on Little Round Top. So some of the best marching of the war. The 6th Corps would have come up in accordion effect. Some people will ask, well, when did they arrive? Was it 2 or was it 8 p.m.? It's all of the above. The front columns would have arrived at 2, and then there's an accordion effect. The rear columns would have fallen behind. Wagon trains get in there sometimes. A horse is de-shoed and doesn't move, and it creates a wedge in the line. Plus the 6th Corps, some of you know, turned off just north of Westminster and moved towards the Taneytown Road, and then had to double back to the Baltimore Pike. So they turned off the Baltimore Pike towards the Taneytown Road. There might have been orders, some confusion that maybe General Meade was still at Taneytown. No one knows why they took this cut-across road towards the Taneytown Road off of the Baltimore Pike. But then they doubled back to the Baltimore Pike and came in behind wagon trains just north of Westminster, which slowed it down. I talked to a guy that endures traffic there daily. He said, that doesn't surprise me. But eventually the 6th Corps got here, and they formed along Rock Creek, which is just north of here. And there's a couple of dams there where there's almost like mill ponds. Then they bathed the chalky dust off of them from the long march. And then they were used to insulate the inside of the Union fishhook. There were 6th Corps troops like Alexander Shaler's brigade. The brigade was around 1,500 troops, was sent to Culp's Hill. Torbett's brigade was sent along with Horatio Wright's brigade, mostly sent just south of the Pennsylvania Memorial off to your left, trying to fill gaps in the line. What the 6th Corps represented in the larger scheme is they represented the reserves. When you have reserves, that's troops that are not on the front lines, it gives you the luxury of going on the offense because you have some, and it also gives you layers of defense. So the 6th Corps just sort of insulated the Union line. Their arrival almost assured the Union Army was going to win the battle. That's an additional 13,000 troops that weren't here for most of the first 2 days that were here by the 3rd day. So this is the Vermont monument then to the Old First, and that's the story of the Old First. And I was reading through their report before I came out today, and they said they got here around 5 p.m. on July 2nd, and they formed essentially right here, where this road was put in the early 1900s. They were part of the refusal line. They connected with the Pennsylvania Reserves and extended the line down here. So, and if you read the Vermont accounts, they talk about throwing up field fortifications. They seem somewhat flimsy. They're not, you don't get the sense that they're stone walls. They try to scratch out a defense here, a natural defense. So we're talking about, again, most people think that the end of the Union line was Little Round Top. But we haven't gotten to the end of the line yet. I mean, this is this tremendous refused line. And also, if you have ears to hear and eyes to see, this refused line, this is a real tough one. I don't know if anybody will get this, but I'll just throw it out there. In the bigger scheme of things, what does the refused line say about General Meade's intentions on July 2nd? and into the morning of the 3rd as he extends this refused line. He just decides he's going to put a police officer facing this way all the way down to cover troops facing towards the peach orchard in the other direction. What does it really say about his intent that he would refuse the line for hundreds of yards like this?
Well, protects his left flank, so then he can attack on the right, which he always wanted to do.
Okay, well certainly that, and the first part of your statement is absolutely spot on in that this is his extra assurance. You stretch out your enemy beyond his effectiveness. He has to keep moving right to try to skirt around your flank, and at some point his line's too thin to do that.
Yeah.
So you just stretch him out until he has no strength to go that way. But what else does it tell us related to whether Meade intended to fight here on July 3rd? Because he was accused in a congressional hearing 8 months later of wanting to leave the battlefield on July 2nd. So what does a refused line tell you about, in a way of answering that?
You're shoring up your position. You're not getting ready to move.
Right.
Exactly. If you exactly, and then even think of it this way. Here's the Union fishhook. Think of my thumb as the refused line. Can everybody see that? This thumb right here?
Mm-hmm.
All right. If the refused line is like my thumb now, which is what it was, bent back at right angles to protect the left flank, that means you intend to stay.
Yeah.
If that thumb, which represents all the refused line, is sticking out, that means you are covering a retreat. So this refused line tells you that those accusations in the congressional hearings were nonsense. All right, let's head on down towards our final stop now. Hopefully save the best for last, and then we'll hoof it back.
My point is this. He just said that thing last year. A million.
Actually, we'll just stop here ever so briefly here. Just want to point out an oddity here on your left. No one's ever been able to know for sure what this structure is. One theory is because it has holes bored in the structure, that it actually might have been a pedestal for the lion that we saw to the Vermont Brigade, and that it was here. That's a theory. Generally what we say is it's a culvert, but it's a pretty elaborate drainage culvert, isn't it?
Sure is.
There's a couple of culverts on the battlefield out on Howard Avenue that look like this in miniature form. So it does bear resemblance to a culvert, but it's just way too grand, you would think. And then there are those bored holes indicating something was attached to it.
Yeah.
And some of the best minds have never been able to say what it was.
Interesting.
Before Tilton, then. Otherwise, we'd have captured it in film.
Yeah, right. Yeah. All kinds of stories. This will be our final stop over here in the shade.
Good idea.
And if I get somebody to volunteer to read the inscription on the monument behind you, if somebody would read that out loud.
This regiment moved from center to this point early July 3rd to resist threatened attack on this flank, moved hastily back in the afternoon to assist in repelling attack on the center, and later took position on the crest of Big Round Top.
Okay, very good, very well done. And what it's telling us is that all of these movements occurred that are on the editing room floor. When we talk about Little Round Top, it's over with the 20th Maine's final swing like a door maneuver. But in reality, the left flank of the 20th Maine was just extended down here. All evening, stone walls were built. Redoubts were scratched out in some places, stone walls built in other places. And then just a wall of humans was brought all the way down to here. And now, a couple things. One, I want to say something about park history. Whenever you see a cul-de-sac like this, it means that
Ran out of money.
they ran out of money. It does. It means they ran out of money. And where's the other cul-de-sac on the battlefield? Benner's Hill up there. They ran out of money there. The road was actually supposed to continue from here over and connect with Hospital Road, which would connect with Powers Hill. If you read the 1871 What to See and How to See It by John Batchelder, one of the first prominent historians, he does a horse and carriage tour. It's like the original CD tour or the app today, but it's handwritten, and he's got little drawings and sketches and moss-covered stone buildings and shady trees, and he makes it very natural and appealing, and he describes the babbling brooks and the creeks and the springs. But in his carriage tour, he makes it clear that there's a road from here that cuts over to Powers Hill, and then from there goes across at McAllister Mill down, and then goes out onto what is Highland Avenue Road and out towards Brinkerhoff Ridge and the East Cavalry Field. Another interesting sort of finer point we would make here on a battle walk is Albion Howe's division actually secured both flanks. So you're talking about this is Howe Avenue. So you have David Russell's brigade here. You had Horatio Wright's troops further to my right, which included the Vermont brigade. And over on the other end of the Union line on Lost Avenue, which is just about as obscure as this, it's the exact opposite flank. You have Thomas Neal's brigade on Lost Avenue. Notice too that if this is the fishhook and the refuse line are my thumbs, we're on this thumb right here. We've been walking. And Cemetery Hill's right at the apex. Round Top's right about here. Well, the same is true over on the Union right flank, in that Neal's brigade or Lost Avenue also points out, which means they're actually it points in. Excuse me. It points in. I had it backwards here. Right. It points in, which means they're don't intend to go anywhere. Right. And notice as we try to make connections and patterns here. Thomas Neal, which is part of Howe's division over on the right flank at Lost Avenue, what is that refused flank turning in to cover and protect? The Baltimore Pike. The refused flank at Round Top that we've been following and tracing all the way down, what road does it connect in and protect? The Taneytown Road. So they're covering the roads, essentially. Isn't that really? It's not just a defense of Little Round Top, it's a defense of the Taneytown Road. Little Round Top's real significance is it's a geographic feature that protects the Taneytown Road, your escape route, and where all your wagon trains are. The same is true with the importance of Culp's Hill. It protects the Baltimore Pike. So that's what that's really all about. Sometimes we miss the importance of the roads that the hills are actually securing. So now, why do these markers here talk about being moved over, Union units being moved over here under the cover of darkness in the wee hours of the morning of the final day of the battle, July 3rd? It's because the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry rode out in that direction south of here, along the Taneytown Road, and then turned west towards the Emmitsburg Road from a little town called Barlow, which is just south of here. The people of Barlow, they didn't call the town Barlow then. It was called Horner's Mill. In fact, the Taneytown Road was known as a Horner's Mill Road also during the battle. It was a mill down there. But the cut across road from Barlow over to Business 15, or the road to Frederick, or the Emmitsburg Road, that's essentially the that's where the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry was. 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry went out there, and the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry was out there too. And what they were trying to do was put up a vedette post. These are, and right in this area more closely, it would have been the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry. 6th is a little bit further west of here, just to be precise. The cavalry post, vedette post, look like birds perched on a high wire. They're cavalrymen on horses, and they're spread apart within hailing distance. Hailing means, hey, if you can hear me, we're close enough. There's not a whole lot of us, so we have to stretch really thin to cover a wide area. The 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry in this area did this all the night of July 2nd. And in the dark, under a full moon, they tried to find where the Confederates were after the attacks on the Round Tops, the Devil's Den, and the wheat field, and then put a cavalry vedette post, almost like a tripwire, draw sort of an artificial line in the sand where you could get an early alarm system if the Confederates ever crossed that line between the Union line and the Confederate line at the end of the second day. And cavalrymen can do that even in the dark. They can find out where each other's horses are, and they can sort of thread their way between the enemy and the troops they're protecting. You know what I mean by tripwire? If the Confederates cross that line, then that sends off alarm bells that the Confederates are headed this way and maybe threatening the flank. All right, so the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry do that. The 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry does that a little bit further west. That's going on all during the night. And what those Pennsylvania Cavalry units discover is evidence that the Confederates are trying to march around under the cover of darkness to take this position, the Round Tops, from reverse.
That was Longstreet's idea.
Longstreet's idea, and if you go back and read Longstreet's official report, Longstreet commanded the 1/3 of Lee's army that was attacking this part of the battlefield. Longstreet says in his report that he had his scouts. He actually elaborated on this in his book later in 1893, Manassas to Appomattox. He said he had his scouts out all night looking for a way around to be able to attack the Round Tops from reverse. Essentially pry the Union away from one of their main avenues of approach, the Taneytown Road. He said Lee showed up on the morning of the 3rd, and he said he had already ordered the movement. You mentioned Bob Crick a little bit earlier. I worked for Bob Crick in 1987 at Fredericksburg. He said, when Longstreet admits in his official report that he had already given the order to extend the Confederate right flank down to here, he said at that point, that omission, he said Longstreet should have been handcuffed at that point, because the orders were to attack Cemetery Hill. That was the whole argument. That's why they're attacking up the Emmitsburg Road, at least to Cemetery Hill. And of course, Bob was trying to add emphasis that Longstreet was changing Lee's plan. He was trying to extend the right flank. Some of you know he wanted to, on a grander scale, he would have liked to interpose between the Union here and Washington. And specifically, we would say between here, the Union left, tactical left, and the supply base at Westminster, which is 24 miles south of here. There were 4,000 tons of medical and food supplies via the Western Maryland Railroad. So if the Confederates maneuvered around, they could block the Union way to Washington and the supply base between here and there. And it would, as Longstreet said in his book years later, it would have made General Meade and the Union Army attack the Confederates on ground of their own choosing. They could have set up a defensive ground. That's what Longstreet really wanted to do. And he says in his report, does Longstreet, that when Lee arrived to talk to him, and this is discussion about they've been building stone walls all night, Longstreet said, I've had my scouts out all night looking for a way around to attack this hill here in reverse. He said in his report that it would be easy enough to do, but it would take some time. Now, there's evidence that he did send scouts out that night. Forensic evidence has been found at the Barlow Fire Station, which is just a few miles down this road. When they built that fire station in the 1950s, they found forensic evidence of cavalry being there. We also know that Texas troops were put out on a sort of a scouting mission to the south. And we also know that Black's 1st South Carolina Cavalry, maybe 100 cavalrymen from Wade Hampton's brigade, were detached to protect Longstreet's flank, and they also were part of that scouting mission. We know skirmishing occurred on Barlow's Green Mount Road, and you've got a map and it shows that road. The 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry and to a lesser extent, the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry south of here, the ones that were trying to scratch out some line between the two sides and create a tripwire, they discovered the scouting mission. And that's what caused the alarm bells to go off at 1, 2, 3 in the morning to extend this refused flank all the way down to here. So Lee and Longstreet had an argument, and Lee said, I want you to take the divisions of Pickett, Heath, and Pender and make a direct assault against the enemy's position, the main position, the Cemetery Hill. Longstreet said no 15,000 men ever ready for battle can take that position. They must have been throwing around numbers, and those numbers were inadequate. He said it would take twice that many, and even then the issue would be in doubt. He also wrote in an article, he said, I was disappointed when Lee came to me on the morning of the 3rd and told me he intended to renew the assault against Cemetery Hill. So he had this other idea. And I had a professor that liked to say, Troy, you need to know a little of the road not taken to better understand the road that was taken. So we need to know that Longstreet thought about this the rest of his life. He even wrote Lafayette McLaws when McLaws was writing his memoirs in 1892. He said, you're going around, you're doing speaking engagements, you're apparently writing some memoirs. Make sure you tell Confederate veterans when you lecture, make sure you write, that what I really wanted to do was to talk Lee into maneuvering the whole army around and essentially interposing between here and Washington and fighting defensively. But he was settling for a tactical maneuver where you attack from behind, remove Round Top as a obstacle, and then you can roll the Union line up Cemetery Ridge. So that's what he was thinking. And going back to our fog and friction of war discussions this summer, which I've tried to adapt to each program, Clausewitz terms fog and friction. Fog is uncertainty. Friction is things that slow down implementation of a plan that you can't expect. Like a broken leg of a horse slows down movements of wagon trains. You lose an hour while you remove the wagons, or the one wagon that's blocking the others. Here, what you're seeing here with these monuments and this whole refused line that we've walked today is a reaction to uncertainty, something that never developed. The conversation with Lee and Longstreet caused all of this to vanish right here. And there's more I can tell you, but we've reached the end of our time. And I just want to thank you for coming out and walking with me today as we looked at Meade's refused flank at Gettysburg.